The stagecoach wheel screamed one last time before digging into the dust of Redemption Gulch. For Ilar Vance, it was the sound of a cage door shutting. She stepped out, and the Arizona sun hit her like a fist. The town was just one street, a scar of baked earth and tired wood sandwiched between two stone mesas that looked like sleeping giants. She clutched her small bag, the knuckles on her gloved hand bone white. She kept her head down, the wide brim of her hat a small mercy, a patch of shade to hide in. Ilar wasn't pretty, not in the way of the magazines that sometimes made their way west. Her face was too sharp, her body too thin, like she'd been carved out of whipcord and worry. But her eyes told the real story. They were the color of a gathering storm, and they never stopped moving. Scanning every dark doorway, every shadow, every man who watched her pass. And they were all watching. The blacksmith's hammer stopped its ringing clang. Laughter from the saloon across the street dried up into a low murmur. A woman shaking a rug from a window froze, her arms locked in place. In a town like Redemption Gulch, new wasn't just new. New was trouble. She pushed her way into the mercantile, the air thick with the smell of flour, leather, and dust. The owner, a man named Henry Gable with a collar dark with sweat, looked her up and down. "Looking for something, miss?" His voice was flat, like the land outside. "A room," she said, her own voice a whisper she barely recognized. "And work. I'm a capable seamstress." Henry grunted, wiping a counter that was already clean. "Boarding house is 2 doors down. Martha's place." He paused, his eyes drifting past her, out the window. "As for work..." His face tightened. Ilar followed his gaze. Across the street, standing in the sliver of shade by the livery, was a man who didn't seem to be part of the town at all. He looked like he'd been carved from the mesas themselves. Apache. That much was clear. High cheekbones, long black hair held back by a leather strap. But it was his size that stole the air from her lungs. He was a giant, not fat, but tall and broad, built like a canyon wolf, all lean muscle and brutal power. He held a string of rabbit pelts in one hand, but his eyes weren't on the store. They were on her, dark, unreadable, and utterly still. It wasn't a threat. It was something worse. It was the look of a hunter who has spotted something on the wind that doesn't belong, something broken. "Pay him no mind," Henry Gable muttered, not looking at her. "That's Kale, Chiricahua. He trades here sometimes. Mostly he just watches. A ghost with a heartbeat, he called him." Ilar looked away first, her heart beating like a trapped bird against her ribs. She felt seen, truly seen. As if those dark eyes had peeled back her dress, her skin, her carefully built wall, and stared right at the secret seared into her flesh. She paid for a bit of flour, her hands shaking as she counted the coins. That night, in a hot, airless room at Martha's boarding house, she lay awake. The sounds of the desert were a crushing silence. In her mind, she saw 2 faces. One was from her past, a face with eyes like cold river stones and a voice like poison honey. The face of Silas Blackwood. The other was the face of the Apache, Kale. In his gaze, she hadn't seen judgment or lust like the others. She had seen something far more terrifying. Recognition, not of her face, but of the fear she wore like a second skin. It was a look that said, "I know what it is to be hunted." And she knew, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice, that Redemption Gulch wasn't the end of the line. It was just the next trap. The days crawled by, each one hotter and dustier than the last. Ilar, or Ara, as she now called herself, became the town's seamstress. She was good with the needle. More than good. She was an artist. She took a small corner in the boarding house parlor, bent over her work, quiet and polite. She gave gentle smiles that never, ever reached her stormy eyes. And she never, ever spoke of where she came from. She became a fixture in the town, a ghost who could mend a torn seam. But it was all a lie. Every time a horse galloped into town, she expected to see his face. Every loud voice from the saloon made her hands tremble, threatening to send the needle skittering across the fabric. She lived on a knife's edge of fear. The high-necked, long-sleeved dresses she wore weren't about being modest in the blistering heat. They were about hiding the truth. The brand on her shoulder was a physical weight, a constant burning reminder of what she'd fled. It was the mark of his property. She saw Cale now and then. He'd appear at the edge of town like a shadow, trade his pelts with Henry Gable, and melt back into the wilderness. He never spoke a word to her, but he was always watching, that unnerving, steady gaze that seemed to see right through her. One afternoon, the desert decided to breathe. A sudden, violent gust of wind ripped her hat from her head. It cartwheeled across the street, landing in the dust near the water trough, right where Cale was letting his horse drink. The town stopped. Every eye was on them, a white woman and the Apache giant. Ara's heart hammered against her ribs. To leave the hat was an insult. To get it meant walking right up to him. Her hair, freed from its pins, whipped across her face. She felt naked, exposed. Slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, Cale bent down. He picked up the hat, holding it carefully by the brim. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed dirt. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the faint scar that cut a line along his jaw. He held out the hat. "Thank you," she whispered. Her gloved fingers brushed his as she took it. His skin was warm and rough as stone. He gave a small nod, his dark eyes holding hers for a second too long. And there it was again, that look, that terrifying recognition. He saw the tremor in her hand. He saw the panic in her eyes. And he didn't judge it. He simply saw it. Then he turned, swung onto his massive horse, and rode away, not with a gallop, but with a steady, relentless pace. Ara fled back to the boarding house, her face on fire. The whispers followed her like flies. That night the town doctor paid her a visit. Dr. Elias Croft was a kind, tired man, with sad eyes behind his spectacles. He needed a shirt mended, he said. But that wasn't why he was there. "Pay them no mind, Miss Vance," he said softly. "This town is small. Anything they don't understand, they fear." He looked at her, his gaze pointed. "Cale, he's not the monster they think. He has more honor than any man in that saloon. He scouted for General Crook. He knows this land, and he knows people." Ara didn't answer. She just stitched. But the doctor's last words echoed in her head. He knows people. The cage was getting smaller. The bars were drawing tighter. And she knew a hunter like Silas Blackwood could see the shadow of a giant Apache from a long, long way off. It wasn't just her he would see. It was the woman hiding behind him. The three riders who came to town didn't look like cowboys. They rode tall and stiff in the saddle, their faces grim, their eyes burning with a cold fire. They wore dark dusters that looked too hot for the Arizona sun, as if the heat couldn't touch them. They didn't stop at the saloon. They rode straight to the sheriff's office. From her window, Ara watched them, and the world fell out from under her feet. It was the way they carried themselves, an arrogant righteousness, a piety that was just a thin mask for cruelty. It was the posture of the faithful, the acolytes of the Church of the Divine Hand. They were Silas Blackwood's men. Her hand froze, the needle slipping. A single drop of blood welled on her fingertip and fell onto the blue fabric she was mending. A crimson stain. A warning. The town was suddenly electric with rumors. Sheriff Brody, A man who was only as brave as his last whiskey was talking to the men. His usual bluster was gone, replaced by a nervous sweat. The leader of the three, a man with a scarred lip and eyes like a snake, did all the talking. His name, she would soon learn, was Jebediah Kane, Blackwood's right hand, his most ruthless enforcer. They didn't have her name, not yet, but they had a description. A woman traveling alone. Slender, with dark hair and stormy eyes. Keeps to herself. A seamstress, perhaps. Jebediah called her a fallen lamb that their benevolent leader, Judge Blackwood, simply wished to guide back to the flock. The description was posted. In the saloon, in the mercantile. And a reward was offered. A big one. Enough to make a desperate man do desperate things. Ara's world started to crack. The friendly nods from the townsfolk turned into suspicious stares. The whispers weren't just about the Apache anymore. They were about her. What was she hiding? Why were these important, dangerous men looking for a simple seamstress? Dr. Croft found her that evening, sitting in the dark, her sewing forgotten in her lap. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he asked gently. She could only nod, a nod of terror choking her. "Silas Blackwood," she finally whispered. The name tasted like ash. The doctor went pale. Everyone in the territory had heard the name. The charismatic preacher they called the Judge. A man who promised salvation, but delivered only silence and unmarked graves. "My God, child," the doctor breathed. "What did you do to get tangled with him?" The words fell from her lips like stones. "I was his wife." She saw the shock in his eyes, but before he could speak, the boarding house door slammed open. Two miners, their eyes wild with greed and whiskey, stood swaying in the doorway. "It's her!" one of them roared, pointing a shaking finger at Ara. "It's the one! Fits the description! We're gonna be rich!" He lunged for her. Dr. Croft moved with surprising speed, shoving a heavy medical book into the man's chest. "Get out of here, you drunken fools!" But it was too late. The shout had been heard. Windows flew open up and down the street. The saloon doors burst open, spilling men out into the night. And at the far end of the street, bathed in moonlight, Jebediah Kane slowly turned his head. His scarred lip curled into a smile. He had found his lamb. "Run, Ara!" Dr. Croft yelled, his voice strained. "Out the back! Head for the mesas! It's your only chance!" Panic, pure and absolute, took over. She fled. Out the back door, over a fence that tore her dress, into the suffocating darkness of the desert. The shouts and jeers of the town faded behind her. She had no water, no food, no plan. She just ran. She ran from the greedy miners. She ran from the dead eyes of Jebediah Kane. She ran from the memory of Silas Blackwood's hand on her shoulder. And she ran straight into the heart of the one place she had been warned against. The unforgiving wilderness. The domain of Kale. The desert at night is not the desert you know by day. It's a world of ink-black shadows and things that move without sound. The heat of the day bleeds away, leaving a cold that seeps into your bones. Ara stumbled on, her thin boots no match for the rocky ground. Thorns tore at her skin and clothes, leaving a crisscross of bloody scratches. Every rustle of a bush was a footstep behind her. Every shadow was a man waiting to grab her. By dawn, she was lost. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by an exhaustion so complete it felt like drowning. Her throat was sandpaper, her lips were cracked. The rising sun wasn't a comfort. It was a promise of a slow, agonizing death. She found a small bit of shade under a rock and collapsed. This was it. This was how it ended. Not at the hands of Silas Blackwood, but cooked alive by the indifferent Arizona sun. She had run so far, fought so hard, only to die alone in the dirt. Tears of pure despair cut clean tracks through the grime on her face. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, a shadow had fallen over her. Her body screamed, tensing for a fight she couldn't win. But it wasn't Jebediah. It was Kale. He stood over her, as silent and solid as the rock formations around them. He held a small water skin. His face was impossible to read, but his dark eyes held something she had never seen before. Pity, maybe. Or maybe just a grim understanding. Fear and thirst fought a war inside her. He was Apache, the boogeyman from every story she'd ever heard. But the thirst was winning. He must have seen the battle in her eyes. He knelt, not too close, and placed the water skin on the ground between them. Then he backed away. A gesture of peace. "Two," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. It was the first time she'd heard him speak. He pointed at the water. Her thirst was a screaming thing. With a hand that shook uncontrollably, she reached for the skin. The water was cool and clean. It was life. She drank until she choked, gasped for air, and drank again. He waited, his patience absolute. When she finally finished, he took the skin and nodded toward the direction she'd come from. "They will follow your tracks," he said. "The town men are fools, but Blackwood's man, he is not." Her blood ran cold. "How do you know that name?" "I listen," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I watch. I know a wolf by the fear it leaves on the wind. You have been running for a long time." He offered her a hand. His grip swallowed hers, strong and solid. She wobbled as she stood, the world spinning. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Where are you taking me?" she rasped. "To a place they will not look," he said, "where the rock holds no trail and the wind carries no scent." He led her deeper into the wilderness, into his world. The journey was a nightmare of pain and exhaustion. He moved with a tireless, ground-eating stride, but he slowed for her, letting her rest when she swayed on her feet. He took her high into the cliffs, to a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of ancient vines. You could stand 10 feet away and never know it was there. Inside, it was cool. A small, smokeless fire burned in a pit. There were pallets of soft furs to sleep on. It was a sanctuary. For 2 days, Ara did nothing but sleep and drink. Kale brought her roasted rabbit and strange roots that tasted sweet. He cleaned her cuts with a salve made from herbs that smelled of pine and rain. He did it all with a quiet efficiency, barely speaking. And in that silence, something shifted. The terror she felt for him began to melt away. He was her captor, but he was also her savior. The monster from the stories was showing her nothing but kindness. She started watching him, watching his large, calloused hands as they skillfully mended a strap or sharpened a knife. There was a stillness in him, a centeredness she had never known. She knew it couldn't last. Jebediah was out there. Silas was out there. But for the first time in years, in this hidden crack in the rock, with this silent giant as her guard, she could breathe. She had fled one prison only to find another. But this one felt strangely like freedom. Then the fever came. It started with a chill she couldn't shake. A cold that came from deep inside her, a cold that had nothing to do with the cool cave air. By nightfall she was on fire. She tossed on the furs, lost in a haze of delirium, mumbling pleas and broken prayers. Kale watched her, his face carved with concern. He knew the signs. Infection. One of the cuts on her shoulder, from her fall, was angry and red. The sleeve of her dress was crusted with blood. If he didn't clean it, the fever would kill her. He knelt beside her, placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. The wound must be cleaned, he said, his voice low and steady, trying to reach her through the fog. I must see it. Her feverish eyes focused on him. A spark of the old fear returned. No, she mumbled. Please, no. It is poisoning your blood, he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. Let me help you. He reached for the high collar of her dress. Her reaction was explosive. She scrambled backward, away from his touch, until her back hit the cold stone wall. No! The word was a raw scream of pure terror, a sound that went far beyond the fever. She clutched the dress at her shoulder, her eyes wide and suddenly, horribly lucid with panic. You can't, she whispered, the words ragged and broken. You can't see. She started to tremble, a deep, soul-shaking tremor. I'm not clean. The words hung in the air of the small cave. Not clean. Cale stared at her. He didn't understand. Clean was about dirt and water, but the shame in her voice, the self-loathing that radiated from her in waves. This was something else. This was a sickness of the spirit. Your spirit is not sick, he said softly, holding her gaze. Your body is. The poison must come out. He moved toward her again, slowly, his hands open. Tears streamed down her face. She was trapped, too weak to fight, too weak to run. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a shuddering, defeated emptiness. She gave a tiny, broken nod. With incredible care, his big fingers worked the small buttons at her neck. He eased the torn, dirty fabric away from her shoulder. And then he saw it, and the air left his lungs. It wasn't just the festering wound, it was what lay beside it. Covering most of her shoulder blade, seared deep into her flesh, was a brand. An ugly, intricate symbol. A clenched fist holding a lightning bolt, surrounded by thorns. It was a mark of ownership, a mark of absolute violation. He had seen cattle branded. He had seen the whip scars on the backs of men. But this was different. This was a zealous, possessive cruelty. A mark designed to burn away a person's very soul. And in that one horrific moment, he understood everything. He understood the depth of her fear. He understood the nature of the man she was running from. This was the work of Silas Blackwood. Without a word, he stood and turned his back to her. He pulled his leather tunic over his head. Aura flinched, not knowing what to expect. And then she saw his back. His skin was a road map of a hard life. Old knife wounds, a puckered scar from a bullet. But low on his left side, just above his hip, was a brand of his own. A crude, simple cross. The mark of the Spanish mission that had taken him as a boy. The place that had tried to beat the Apache out of him. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp in the firelight. We all have things that mark us, he said, his voice quiet. They do not make us unclean. They are the story of our survival. Ara stared at the story written on his skin. Then she looked at her own brand, the symbol of her shame. And for the very first time, she saw it not as a mark of defilement, but as proof that she had escaped, that she had survived. The dam she had built inside herself, the one she had held together for years, with nothing but pure will, finally broke. A deep, wrenching sob tore from her throat. Then another. It was the sound of years of pain finally being set free. Cale knelt before her again. He didn't touch her. He just waited. A solid, silent anchor in her storm. When her sobs finally quieted, he took a clean cloth and began to clean her wound. The ugliest, most hidden part of her had been laid bare, and the man who had seen it hadn't run away. He had shown her his own scars, and he wasn't the only one with a connection to that mission. The place where they marked me, he said, his voice a low growl. It is now his holy ground. Blackwood built his church on its bones. The twist was so sharp, so unexpected, it cut right through Ara's grief. Their pasts weren't just similar, they were intertwined. This wasn't a random meeting in the desert. It was something else entirely. It was fate, and it was demanding a reckoning. With the fever broken and her secret revealed, the air in the cave changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, unspoken trust. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was comfortable. As Ara regained her strength, Kale started to teach her. Not with words, but with actions. He showed her which plants could heal and which could feed. How to find water by watching the birds. How to walk so the earth barely knew she was there. She was a quick learner. Her senses had been honed to a razor's edge by years of living in fear. "Blackwood's man, Jebediah," Kale said one night by the fire. "He will not give up. A wolf with the scent of blood will hunt until it or its prey is dead." "Then we can't stay here forever," Ara said. Her voice was stronger now. There was a new hardness in it. "No," Kale agreed. "We cannot run forever. A hunt must end. The hunter makes his kill, or the prey turns and fights." The thought of fighting still scared her. But it wasn't the paralyzing terror of before. It was the sharp, cold fear of a soldier before a battle. He started to tell her his story, not just about the mission, but about his sister. She had been taken with him. He had escaped. She had not. He had spent years searching, only to find she had died within those cursed walls, years before Blackwood ever arrived. "They call me a ghost," he said, his eyes lost in the flames. "Perhaps they are right. I live in the spaces between. The past is a shadow I cannot outrun. And the future has no place for people like us," Ara added softly. Then she told him everything. She told him about the handsome, charismatic preacher who had promised her a penniless orphan, a home. She told him how the love turned to control, how the sermons on purity became excuses for punishment. And she told him her final secret, the real reason they would never stop hunting her. "I wasn't just his wife," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I kept his records. I wrote down everything." She looked at him, her storm-gray eyes burning. "When I ran, I didn't just take myself. I took his ledger." Kale stared at her. This changed everything. She wasn't just a victim. She held the weapon that could destroy Silas Blackwood entirely. A book filled with names, dates, and crimes. A detailed account of his land grabs, his extortions, the people who had entered his community and simply vanished. The stakes were no longer just her life. It was the soul of the entire territory. Their sanctuary was shattered a few nights later. They were outside the cave, Kale pointing out the star patterns, when he suddenly went rigid. He held up a hand for silence, his head tilted. "What is it?" Ara whispered. "Horses," he growled. "And a campfire, down canyon. They are close." Jebediah had found them. He was a better tracker than Kale had given him credit for. The hunt was on again. But this time things were different. Ara was no longer just running for her life. She was fighting for justice, and she wasn't alone. They moved by the light of a sliver of moon. The landscape was a treacherous maze of rock and thorn. Kale led her through it like a spirit, his huge frame melting into the shadows. He pushed her to her limits, forcing her to scale rock faces that left her muscles screaming, to wade through ice-cold streams to hide their scent. Once they lay flat on a high ledge, hidden by a single scraggly juniper bush. Below them, not 50 feet away, Jebediah and his 2 men rode past. Ara could hear the crunch of their horses' hooves on the gravel. She could hear Jebediah's low, angry voice cursing the land, cursing her. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure they would hear it. Kale placed a heavy, calming hand on her shoulder. Solid, reassuring. The riders passed. They were gone. And Ara realized something. They weren't just running anymore. Kale wasn't just leading her away from the hunters. He was leading the hunters deeper and deeper into his world, a world where he made the rules. He was wearing them down, exhausting their horses, frustrating their efforts. He was turning the tables. They took a short rest in a narrow slot canyon, the moonlight a pale ribbon far above them. Ara looked at Kale. His face was grim, focused. He was no longer the quiet outcast from town. He was a warrior. "You're not running from them," she said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "You're hunting them." A faint, grim smile touched his lips for the first time. "A man who lives in the spaces between learns he must make his own place," he said. "Blackwood's shadow fell over you. Now it has fallen over my home. A shadow like that must be removed." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "Not by running from it, but by cutting out its heart." Ara looked down at her own hands. They were scratched and bruised, but they were steady. She thought of Silas, of his cold, righteous fury. She thought of the brand on her skin, his mark of submission. And she thought of the ledger, hidden deep in her carpetbag. "Then let's cut it out," she said, her voice echoing in the stone silence. The prey had turned, and she was ready to fight. "We are going back," Kale said. The words were so insane, Ara was sure she'd misheard him. They were crouched on a high ridge, looking down at the distant, dusty smear of Redemption Gulch. "Back there. They'll see us coming a mile off. It's a trap." "Jebediah thinks he is the hunter," Kale explained, his voice calm. "He believes we are lost and cornered in the wilderness. He will never expect us to walk back into his snare." He looked at her. "He is hunting a frightened woman and the savage who helped her. He is not prepared for what he will find." The plan was desperate. It was terrifying. And it was brilliant. They came down from the mesa at dusk, slipping into the town like ghosts. The town was wound tight as a spring. Jebediah and his men had taken over the saloon, their swaggering presence silencing the entire street. The first part of the plan was chaos. Using his deep knowledge of the land, Kale started a small, contained brush fire on the east side of town. The wind carried the smoke and the angry orange glow toward the buildings. Shouts of "Fire!" erupted. Men spilled out of the saloon, grabbing buckets, their attention fixed on the flames. In the confusion, Kale slipped into the livery stable. A few silent cuts of his knife, a few sharp slaps on the rumps, and Jebediah's horses were gone, galloping wildly into the night. The hunters were now on foot. While the town was distracted, Ara walked straight to the doctor's office. Elias Croft opened the door, his face a mask of shock. "My God, child, I thought you were dead." "Not yet, doctor," she said, her voice hard as iron. "But I need your help, and you are going to give it to me." She pushed past him into his office. "I know who you are, Elias," she said, her voice low. "I know you worked for him, for Blackwood. Your name is in his ledger." The doctor stumbled back, his face ashen. "I left. I ran away when I saw what he was." "It doesn't matter," Ara cut him off. "Tonight, you choose a side. For good." Meanwhile, Kale dealt with the other two men. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. One man running toward the fire was simply dropped by a single crushing blow from the shadows. The other found himself face to face with an Apache giant in a dark alley, a knife at his throat before his hand could even clear his holster. Kale left him bound and gagged. 2 down, 1 to go. Jebediah stood in the middle of the street, bellowing orders about the fire, when a figure stepped out of the shadows of the mercantile. It was Ara. She stood alone, her dress torn, her face smeared with dirt. But she stood tall. Her chin was up. Her eyes were chips of ice. "Looking for me, Jebediah?" she called out. His face split into a vicious grin. The fool girl had come back to him. "The judge will be pleased," he snarled, raising his pistol. "He prefers to deliver his justice personally, but in your case, I'll make an exception." Before he could fire, another shadow detached itself from the wall. Cale. He held a bow. An arrow knocked and aimed directly at Jebediah's heart. "She is not alone," Cale's voice boomed across the street. Jebediah froze. The townsfolk, torn between the fire and the standoff, stared in silence. But this wasn't about a gunfight. It was about the truth. Just then, Dr. Croft burst out of his office, holding a lantern high. "This woman is no sinner," he shouted, his voice ringing with a strength no one had ever heard from him before. "She is a survivor of the monster you serve." He strode toward Ara. "Show them, child. Show them the benevolence of your Judge Blackwood." This was it, the hardest part. Every instinct screamed at her to hide. But she met Cale's gaze across the street. She saw the faith in his eyes, and she found her strength. With a deep breath, she turned her back to the crowd. She reached for the torn collar of her dress and pulled it aside. Dr. Croft raised the lantern. In the flickering yellow light, the ugly, twisted brand on her skin was revealed to all. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They'd seen brands on cattle. This was something else. This was the mark of a slave. Jebediah's smug confidence wavered. He had expected her to be ashamed, to be broken. His power, Blackwood's power, was built on secrets and shame. Era was dragging it all into the light. "This is the mark of your judge," she cried, her voice trembling but strong. "This is his purity. This is the brand of a master, not a savior." But she wasn't done. From a hidden pocket, she pulled out a small leather-bound book, the ledger. "And this is his word," she shouted, flipping it open. "He took Jacob Smith's farm, the man from Two Creeks. Says here Jacob donated it before he disappeared." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of them knew Jacob Smith. "And what about the Miller family?" she went on, her voice rising. "The ones who tried to leave his flock. It says here they were lost in a flash flood, but there hasn't been a flood in that valley in 20 years. The faces of the townsfolk shifted from fear to a slow, burning rage. These weren't abstract sins. These were names they knew, crimes committed in their own backyard. Jebediah saw it was over. He saw his power melting away. In a final act of desperation, he swung his pistol away from Ara, toward the bigger threat. Toward Cale. But Cale was waiting. The bowstring sang. The arrow flew. It didn't hit his heart. It wasn't a killing shot. It was a message. The arrow slammed into Jebediah's thigh, pinning him to the dirt. He screamed and dropped his gun. It was over. The fire was put out. Jebediah and his men were locked in the town jail, waiting for the territorial marshals. The town's testimony, led by a newly brave Sheriff Brody, would be damning. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose, Ara and Cale stood at the edge of town. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She looked back at the dusty street. She had faced her demon there. She had spoken her truth. It was no longer a place to hide. "I don't know," she admitted. For the first time, not knowing felt like freedom, not fear. "I'm not that scared seamstress anymore. I know that much." She looked at him, at the giant who had seen the ugliest part of her and shown her his own scars. "What about you? Will you go back to being a ghost?" Cale looked out at the vast wilderness, his home. Then he looked back at her. A real smile, slow and genuine, transformed his harsh face. "A ghost cannot feel the sun," he said, "and I think I am ready to feel the sun again." He swung himself onto his horse and looked down at her, offering his hand. "This is not over," he said, his eyes burning with a new purpose. "We cut off the hand of the snake, but the head is still out there." She took his hand without hesitation. "The world is a large place," he said, pulling her up behind him. "We will find our own space in it, one of our own making." Aura Vance, the woman who came to Redemption Gulch to disappear, rode out into the sunrise. Beside her was the giant they called a ghost. They weren't running anymore. Armed with the truth in a leather-bound book, they were riding to war. The story of Aura and Kale is a reminder that our deepest scars, the things we think make us unworthy, can become our greatest weapons. It shows us that true strength isn't found in hiding, but in having the courage to drag the darkness into the light. Their journey was far from over. It was just beginning. A new chapter, ready to be written not in fear, but in fire and justice. If this story of survival and fighting back resonated with you, do us a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story where the heroes are as scarred and real as the land they ride through. And most importantly, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because we have so many more tales of the broken, the brave, and the redeemed waiting to be told. Thank you for listening.